The police car rolled to a slow, deliberate stop, its flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the quiet suburban street. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned to face the officer stepping out, his eyes flicking between me and the furious woman standing on my lawn. Linda, arms crossed and nostrils flaring, looked like a villain savoring the climax of her grand scheme. Before I could get a word in, she shrieked and stormed up to the officer. "I've had enough of these troublemakers ruining the peace. You need to do something." The officer, an older man with weary eyes, sighed and pulled out a notepad. "And by troublemakers, you mean the kids playing in their own yard?" "Yes," Linda snapped, jabbing a manicured finger toward my children, who were now clustered near the swing set, their wide eyes filled with confusion. "They're loud, they're obnoxious, and I've told this guy," she pointed at me, "to control his little monsters, but he won't listen. It's a clear violation of noise rules." I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to laugh at how ridiculous this was. "Officer, all they were doing was playing tag." Linda gasped, clutching her chest like I'd confessed to treason. "Playing tag at this hour? It's nearly." She glanced at her watch, faltering for a split second. 6:15 p.m. The officer gave her a long, unimpressed stare. "That's not exactly a noise violation." Her face twitched. "It's disturbing. I work hard. I deserve peace and quiet in my own neighborhood." Before I could reply, my youngest daughter, Emily, still clutching her stuffed bunny, tilted her head and whispered loudly, "Daddy, is that the mean lady who said we should stay inside forever?" The officer's lips twitched, barely hiding a smirk. I didn't bother holding back. "Yes, honey, that's her." Linda let out an exaggerated gasp. "This is harassment. Are you hearing this?" The officer exhaled, clearly done with her antics. "Do you have any proof these kids are breaking any laws?" Linda squared her shoulders. "I don't need proof. I know the law. Kids shouldn't be allowed to scream like wild animals whenever they feel like it." The officer scribbled something in his notepad. Linda's smug look returned, until he looked up and said, "I'm going to need to see your ID." For the first time, she hesitated. "What? What?" "Because you just admitted to knowingly filing a false police report." Linda blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a broken toy. "I know. They were disturbing the peace at 6:15 p.m. The officer tilted his head. "Do you hear yourself right now?" Her arms flailed. "There are laws. I won't be disrespected like this." He flipped his notepad shut. "Do you know the penalty for misusing emergency services?" Her face turned a vibrant shade of red. "Penalty? Yes," he continued. "Wasting police time for personal grudges can lead to a fine. And from what I hear, this isn't your first complaint about these kids, is it?" Linda's eyes darted to me. I raised an eyebrow, savoring the moment. "Oh no, officer, she's been at this for months." He nodded. "Then I'll need to file a report." Panic replaced her smugness. Wait, you're fining me?" "That's how it works," he said, pulling out a ticket book. My kids, sensing the tide turning, whispered excitedly to each other. Even Emily, usually shy around strangers, giggled and hugged her bunny. Linda stomped her foot. "I called you to deal with them." "And I did," the officer replied, writing her name. "I found no crime, except yours." The rage that erupted from her could have lit up the whole block. She sputtered, hands flapping like a broken windmill, her face twisted in disbelief so dramatic it belonged in a movie. "This is insane. This is abuse of power. This is a $500 fine," he finished, tearing the ticket free and handing it to her. Linda snatched it like it was toxic, hissing, "You'll regret this," her eyes narrowing at me. I smiled, hands in my pockets. "Oh, I really doubt that." She spun on her heel and marched back to her house, stomping on my kids' sidewalk chalk drawings in a final petty jab. The officer exhaled and glanced at me. "Some people, huh?" I chuckled. "You have no idea." As he walked back to his car, my son whispered, "Dad, does this mean we can play louder now?" I grinned. "Maybe just a little." The car pulled away, and just like that, the most absurd, satisfying showdown I'd ever witnessed was over. Or so I thought. Linda wasn't done, not even close. She didn't take the fine well. I'd never seen anyone so personally offended by a piece of paper. She stood on her porch, gripping the ticket like she could crush it with sheer fury. For a second, I almost pitied her, Almost. Then she locked eyes with me, her glare dripping with spite, signaling I wasn't just dealing with an annoyed neighbor anymore. I'd started a war. The next morning, I figured things might settle down. She'd embarrassed herself, gotten fined, and lost her argument. But Linda wasn't the type to back off. She doubled down. I stepped outside for the paper, and there she was, stiff as a board on her lawn, arms crossed, staring like I'd ruined her life. "Morning, Linda," I said, keeping it casual. She huffed dramatically. "Don't think this is over." I sighed. "Linda, it's a fine. Pay it and move on." "Oh, I will," she sneered. "But I'll also make sure this neighborhood doesn't turn into a circus because of your wild, uncontrollable kids." I bit my tongue to keep from laughing. She stepped closer, voice low. "You have no idea who you're messing with." With that ominous threat, she spun around and stormed inside. I shook my head. Most people would have quit by now, but Linda had convinced herself she was on a noble crusade. Too bad for her my kids weren't about to stop playing just because she hated joy. That afternoon, I sat on my porch, watching my kids run around, laughing and chasing each other. Everything felt calm, until Linda's front door slammed open. She stormed across her lawn, a folded paper clenched in her fist. "Huh," she barked, waving it in my face. "Thought you were clever, didn't you?" I blinked. "What?" She shoved the paper at me. "The HOA sent you a warning." I unfolded it. Sure enough, it was an official notice claiming a complaint about excessive noise after reasonable hours. Linda practically vibrated with glee. "This is no joke. You broke the rules. Now face the consequences." I read it again, then checked the timestamp. My eyes narrowed. "Linda, this says the violation was at 10 p.m. last night." "Exactly," she snapped. "See? The HOA agrees with me." I smirked. "Linda, my family was out of town last night." The color drained from her face so fast I thought she'd faint. Her mouth flapped uselessly. That's not possible," she stammered. "Oh, it is," I said, pulling out my phone. "Want to see the security footage?" She paled further. That's not necessary." I ignored her, tapping my app. Moments later, a video played. Our empty driveway, the silent house, and a timestamp proving we weren't home. I turned the phone toward her. Her jaw clenched so tight I thought she'd crack a tooth. "So," I said, barely hiding my amusement, "either my house is haunted or you filed a fake complaint." Linda made a strangled noise. "This is ridiculous. The HOA wouldn't just make this up." I shrugged. "Guess I should let them know someone's submitting false reports." Her eyes widened. "Wait, too late." I was already dialing the HOA. The call was short. Once I mentioned the footage, the rep sighed and promised to investigate. Code for Karen's in trouble. Linda stood frozen, her mind racing for an escape. "You're manipulating the system," she sputtered. "You probably faked that footage." I chuckled. "Sure, Linda, I faked a whole vacation just to trick you." Her face twisted into something ugly. "This isn't over." I sighed. "Linda, maybe let it go? You're only making it worse for yourself." But she wasn't listening. She stomped back to her house, slamming the door. I knew she wasn't done. She was just planning her next move. And if I'd learned anything, she wouldn't quit quietly. I was right. The next day, I woke up to find my kids' sidewalk chalk drawings, a colorful mess of bunnies and stars, smeared into muddy streaks. Emily stood beside the ruin, clutching her bunny, tears in her eyes. "Daddy, who did this?" I already knew. Across the street, Linda sipped coffee on her porch, smirking. I took a deep breath, keeping my temper in check. This was getting out of hand. If she wanted to play dirty, I'd get my hands messy too. Linda thought she'd win this war. She had no idea what was coming. The chalk incident was the last straw. I'd put up with her nonsense long enough. I wasn't about to sink to her level, but I wouldn't let her keep winning either. She'd made it clear she wouldn't stop until she ruled the neighborhood, and that wasn't happening on my watch. My kids were upset, but I promised them it'd be okay. Deep down, I knew this was far from over. Linda had declared war, and it was time to fight back. That afternoon, I talked to other parents in the neighborhood. If Linda was targeting me, she'd likely harassed others too. Sure enough, mentioning her name triggered groans and eye rolls. "She's been a nightmare since she moved in," one mom sighed. "Last summer, she called the HOA on us because our kids had water balloons in the yard, said they'd ruin the pavement." A dad shook his head. She tried to ban my son from the pool for splashing too much. It's a pool. What'd she expect? I couldn't believe it. Linda wasn't just after my family. She'd been terrorizing everyone for years. No one had stopped her because no one wanted the hassle. But now we had a chance to end her reign. That evening, I gathered evidence. The fake HOA complaint, security footage proving we were out of town, and statements from neighbors about her harassment. My plan was simple. Present it all to the HOA and demand action. No more lies, no more petty revenge. If she wanted dirty, I'd fight with facts. But Linda wouldn't make it easy. The next morning, another HOA letter arrived, claiming my kids were recklessly riding bikes in a dangerous manner, endangering the community. I laughed out loud. My kids, 7 and 10, rode in circles pretending to be superheroes. My neighbor snorted when I showed him. Reckless bike riding? What's this, a Fast and Furious sequel? Linda was behind it. No doubt. Losing to the cop hadn't stopped her. She was flooding the HOA with garbage complaints. I didn't waste time. I went straight to the HOA office and asked for Mark, the guy handling my case. A middle-aged man who'd clearly seen his share of crazy neighbors. He looked annoyed as I laid out the footage and complaints. Linda's abusing the system, I said. She's filing lies, wasting time, and harassing families. This has to stop. Mark flipped through the papers, irritation growing. You're not the first to complain about her, he muttered. We've had issues. I raised an eyebrow. He sighed. We've talked to her, but she twists the rules. She hasn't broken major bylaws, just a ton of minor ones. I pointed at the fake noise complaint. She made this up. She knew I wasn't home. That's harassment. Mark rubbed his temples. You're right. If we can prove she knowingly lied, that's grounds for action. So what's next? I asked. We'll investigate her formally, statements, footage, and a confrontation with the evidence. Good, I said, because she's not stopping. She trashed my kids' chalk drawings yesterday. What's next? Slashing tires. Mark shook his head. She really thinks she owns this place. I left feeling progress was finally happening. Linda had bullied people into silence for years, but she'd picked the wrong fight this time. That night, taking out the trash, I saw a figure near my driveway. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but then it moved. Someone was by my trash cans. My heart raced as I stepped closer. The figure turned, and under the streetlight, I saw Linda holding a spray paint can. We stared at each other for a split second. Then, like a cartoon villain caught red-handed, she yelped, dropped the can, and bolted. I looked down. My mailbox now read, "Noisy brats live here," in sloppy letters. I rubbed my temples. She'd lost it. But she'd forgotten my cameras. The next morning, I took the footage to Mark. No hesitation this time. He called a board meeting. By day's end, Linda was under investigation. She'd spent years making everyone miserable. Now she'd face the consequences. And I had a feeling she wouldn't take it well. The neighborhood was tense after Linda's spray paint stunt. It wasn't just me. Everyone she'd tormented was done. Word spread fast. By morning, neighbors gathered near my driveway, staring at her handiwork and swapping horror stories. She called the cops on my teen for playing basketball. One guy grumbled. She left a note in my mailbox because my lawn wasn't perfect, a woman added. She reported me for weeds, and I don't even have a garden, another said. She made my 6-year-old cry over sidewalk chalk, a mom said bitterly. Linda's war wasn't just with me. It was with everyone who didn't bow to her rules. She'd gotten cocky, thinking no one would fight back. That was changing. I met with Mark again that afternoon. He assured me Linda faced serious consequences, fines, complaint bans, maybe even HOA removal if the board ruled against her. It was the justice we'd all waited for. But Linda wouldn't go quietly. That evening, my wife glanced out the window and froze. You've got to be kidding. I looked. Linda was in her yard with a clipboard, marching to neighbors' doors, clearly arguing. Curious, I stepped outside. She spotted me, her face twisting with fury, and stomped over, waving the clipboard. You'll regret this, she hissed. I sighed. Regret what, Linda? Making you face your actions? She shoved the clipboard at me. This is a petition to have you removed from the neighborhood. I stared, incredulous. You're serious? Very, she snapped. You've harassed me, spread lies, turned everyone against me. I didn't turn anyone against you, I said, fighting a laugh. You did that yourself. Her eyes narrowed. Think this is funny? A little, yeah. Her nostrils flared. We'll see if you're laughing when you explain to your kids why they're homeless. My patience snapped. I stepped closer, voice low. You've scared my kids, filed fake complaints, vandalized my property, and you think you're the victim? She scoffed. I was defending my rights. Linda, I said, shaking my head. No one wants you here anymore. You've made this place hell for years. Now that people are standing up, you're freaking out. Her expression flickered, but she straightened. We'll see who wins. She stormed off to the next house, but I knew her plan was doomed. No one would sign. She'd just given us more ammo. The next few days were chaos. Linda kept pushing her petition, but it backfired. The more she ranted, the more people shared their own stories. She wasn't the victim. She was the problem. Mark called again. We've got over a dozen complaints about her this week. Her case is going to the board. I smiled. What if she loses? Fined, banned from complaints, and legal action if she keeps it up. Perfect. But Linda had one last desperate play. The night before the HOA meeting, my doorbell rang. It was Linda, arms crossed, fury and desperation in her eyes. What do you want? I asked, exhausted. Her voice was tight. Call off your campaign. I laughed. It's not a campaign. It's consequences. She stepped closer. You think you've won? I have connections on the board. They like me. I tilted my head. Connections? Her smirk faltered. You don't know everything. No, I said. But tomorrow, you'll face a room full of people sick of you, and you won't wriggle out of it. Her face twisted. You'll regret this. Second time you've said that, I replied, and I'm still not the one in trouble. She huffed, stormed off, and I shut the door, satisfied. Tomorrow, she'd finally lose. The HOA meeting buzzed with anticipation. So many people showed up they moved it to a bigger room. Linda had alienated everyone, and they wanted to see her fall. I arrived early. Neighbors were already there, whispering. Mark nodded at me, looking drained. She sent 3 emails this morning. One was just unfair in caps. I smirked. Sounds right. Linda strutted in, head high, clutching papers like she was accepting an award, not facing punishment. The room hushed as Mark began. We're here to address complaints about a homeowner accused of harassment, false reports, and violating HOA rules. We've investigated and will review the evidence. Linda shot up. I'd like to speak first. Mark sighed. You'll respond after we present the case. She huffed but sat, arms crossed like a sulky kid. Mark listed her offenses: false police calls, fake HOA complaints, every petty grudge backed by emails, footage, and statements. When he showed the spray paint footage, someone whistled. Linda paled but forced a smirk. This is a smear campaign. I've only tried to keep order while others let chaos reign. Mark didn't flinch. We have proof you filed false complaints. I reported disturbances. It's my right. Not when they didn't happen, he shot back. You accused a family of noise when they weren't home, reported kids for bikes, called cops over tag. That's harassment. She scoffed. Everyone's against me because I enforce rules. A woman turned. Linda, you tried to ban my 8-year-old from the pool for splashing. That's not rules, it's misery. A man added. She fined me for too many flowers. Linda turned red. Landscaping rules exist. Mark cut in. It's clear your actions have distressed multiple families. The board has decided you're fined for harassment, false reports, and vandalism, and banned from complaints for a year. Linda leapt up. What? If this continues, Mark said, we'll escalate to legal action. Harassment isn't tolerated. This is insane. I'm the victim, she yelled. If you can't follow these terms, Mark replied, sell your house and leave. A murmur spread, polite for get out. Linda had nothing left. After a tense silence, she grabbed her papers and stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled. The room relaxed. People laughed, chatted, relieved. It was over. A neighbor clapped my back. You did it. You got rid of her. I chuckled. She's not gone yet, but she can't ruin our lives anymore. Mark approached. If she breaks the ruling, tell me. No more chances. I nodded. Thanks. Walking home, I smiled. Linda had tried to control us, but she'd isolated herself. My kids played outside, carefree. It was peaceful, normal. But I knew she'd scheme again. She just didn't have the power anymore. For days, it was bliss. No cops, no complaints, no Linda screaming. The kids played freely, their laughter unhindered. Linda stayed quiet, her car in the driveway, blinds shut. It was eerie, like a villain plotting in her lair. I didn't relax. She wasn't sulking. She was planning. My hunch was right. One afternoon, my neighbor Sarah knocked, exasperated. "You won't believe this." She handed me a letter Linda had slipped into mailboxes. "Dear neighbors, our once orderly community is in chaos. The HOA is corrupted by rule breakers, and I've been silenced for upholding standards. Sign this petition to remove the unfair HOA leadership and restore our values." I nearly laughed. "She's trying to overthrow the HOA?" Sarah nodded. "She came to my door, said she'll sue them, and report us if we don't help once she's back in power." I pinched my nose. She'd lost it. Word spread fast. A group chat formed. Neighbors vented. "She's a dictator," one texted. "What do we do?" another asked. I had a plan. Ignore her. Let her bury herself. No one signed her petition. Instead, more complaints piled up against her. Mark sent a notice. Her coup was meaningless. She was still banned. Her plan flopped. Then, one day, I saw her dragging a "for sale" sign onto her lawn, stabbing it into the ground with fury. She'd realized she'd lost everything. Hours later, Mark called. "She's selling. Notified us today." I exhaled. She couldn't handle losing. She did it to herself, he said. No one wants to live where they're hated. Over weeks, Linda faded, blinds shut, no more rants. When she emerged, she avoided everyone, moving fast, head down, not the queen she once was. Then moving trucks came. Neighbors watched, not gloating, just confirming she was gone. Linda stayed silent, supervising movers. Her last glance at me held no words, just defeat. She drove off, and a cheer rose, quiet, relieved. She was gone. Life normalized. Kids played, neighbors smiled. Sarah walked by one day. "It's better without her." I nodded. "Way better." A new family moved in, friendly, with kids who drew chalk art right away. No one stopped them. This time, no one ever would.